Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gerken. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week we've got an aquatics episode, Joe, so what do you want to talk about today?
Yeah, it's getting a little chillier out there, and so that's a good time for some cold water fish, and I thought today we'd talk about trout. Kansas has a great fishing program, a trout fishing program, where they take hatchery-raised rainbow trout and stock them throughout the state just to give another fishing opportunity in the colder months. So good opportunity to talk about that program, but also a little bit of the biology and life history of some of the trout species.
Sure. So, taking a step back from Kansas a little bit, what are the species of trout that we have in North America?
Yeah, so there's about 7 species that are really found in North America, and the big ones are the Pacific trout that are native to our area. And so these 2 species are native. The rainbow trout, cutthroat trout are the 2 main native species that we have. And so there's also brook trout that are found. They were found out in the Atlantic area, so out on the East Coast. And so those are kind of the main groups of trout that when we talk about native trout that we're thinking about. And that includes species, and Pacific species include species like rainbow trout or cutthroat. The Atlantic species, that brook trout's kind of the poster child out there. And so those are the native ones. And then we've introduced quite a few non-native species. Brown trout come to mind as a really good example. Those came from Europe. Most of them came from the Germany area, but different places around Europe and were brought over. So lots of different species that we have out there, lots of different fishing opportunities. There's also some species that are found in really small rivers, kind of isolated areas, really big targets for, fishermen that want to go out and kind of complete the trifecta, chase some of those unique groups. So fun diversity there of different types of trout that we have.
Cool. Do we have any native trout in Kansas?
Nope. In Kansas, there are no native trout. And so every trout that we catch is going to be stocked. So there's one exception to that. But for the most part, the water in Kansas gets too warm for trout to really thrive. They're a cold water fish, so they need colder water. The summers in Kansas are just too hot. So it's generally not the water temperature itself that causes harm to fish, but when they're hot, they're stressed out. They tend to have weaker body quality, and then they get diseased or ill easily. When that happens, their numbers just plummet, they die, and so we see that kind of warm water take over and doesn't really allow for these trout to be native in Kansas.
Okay. Well, I guess one of the things that I'm always really interested in is, what species are supposed to be in different places. And I've done a little bit of trout fishing. I'm definitely not a trout angler by any means, but Northern California, up around the Lake Tahoe area, I got to do a little bit of fly fishing up there, and just thinking about the species that I caught, I remember catching brown trout there, brook trout, rainbows, done a little bit of trout fishing in Colorado up around Breckenridge too, and there I caught some what did we catch? We caught brook trout there. I don't think I caught any rainbows, or I definitely didn't catch any cutthroats. So, more specifically, which of these trout species are native in some of those places, and which ones have been introduced?
Yeah, so the rainbow trout and the cutthroat trout would be native species there. There's some Apache trout that are found kind of in little niche areas. Gila trout are found down in the Southwest. But the species that are going to be, if we went back a few hundred years, we would be catching rainbow trout. You'd be catching cutthroat trout. And then a lot of the different species that we're talking about are subspecies of those. The Gila trout and Apache trout are both types of cutthroat trout.
Okay.
Right? And so we see examples of that. People will talk about, hey, what about steelheads? I hear that a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And steelheads are really genetically, they're a rainbow trout. And so, we get variations like that. Trout have a lot of different groups, but genetically speaking, there's really those 2 species. And so thinking about the species that we have, it really should go back to those two. Now, we really like to catch trout, or at least we really liked to, 40 or 50 years ago, so much that we stocked a lot of these fish. We've changed their range a lot. And so there's been a lot of expansion, a lot of introduced species that now I would say are probably, part of the ecosystem introduced, but they've naturalized in a lot of those habitats. So another really important thing to keep in mind is that we've changed the habitat in a lot of these different areas. So putting in reservoirs or little lakes, side chutes, things like that would not have historically been there, along with those man-made changes in habitat, many of which came for important reasons, controlling flooding, for example, or water for different towns. But in doing that, we've kind of changed the fish population. So different changes, but there's those two main groups that are out there. And on there's the East Coast too, I guess. Don't forget those trout that are out on the East Coast that we've mentioned before too.
So the brook trout that I caught in California and Colorado, those were introduced but naturalized.
Yep.
The rainbows in California were definitely probably native. What about the ones in Colorado? Is that part of the native range?
Yeah, you're starting to get on the edge of their habitat there. So it's probably, it depends. If you're in some of those smaller streams, probably are native groups. We're catching smaller ones. We've introduced a lot of them too. We've got some trophy fisheries out there, and some of those have been introduced. So kind of a hybrid group there in Colorado. The ones out in California almost definitely were native species out there, native individuals.
Cool. What about things that we call trout that may not necessarily be trout?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind there are char, and there's a lot of different species of char, but brook trout are small char, so they're not technically a trout species, even though we've been talking about them like that. Lake trout can get really big, and lake trout are a type of char, and so, but they look like trout, right? And so if we were to pull them out, if you went fishing for them, they'd act like trout. They'd be very similar, but from a scientific standpoint, they are definitely a different group there.
Cool. I guess it's surprising for me to hear that brook trout are actually char, because they pretty well look like just a regular old trout.
Yeah.
But thinking about lake trout, it's easy to see the differences, that forked tail, and there are some big differences. What about a bull trout? Would that be a char, or is that a trout?
Well, that's generally a char too. There's going to be some regional differences there on what a bull trout is. That's just going to kind of depend on where you're at, but most of the time those are not trout, right? You can get big brown trout, again, that people might refer to as bull trout. People can use the term bull trout to mean a really, really big rainbow, right? So you get kind of a lot of that variation depending on where you're at. So lots of different changes. Those endemic terms, that's why we have, scientific names, right? My students like to moan about getting them to learn that Latin. But the reason is that if we're talking about something on paper with the Latin name, we know what it is, right? And that gets a little bit tricky when we start talking about some of these variations in groups. And so a steelhead versus a rainbow, they look a lot different. But if we're talking about Oncorhynchus micus, that's a rainbow trout, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what it looks like, regardless of whether it has that bright pink line and a bunch of spots, or it's more silver and universal in color. So fun to kind of start thinking about, just getting back to science. Why do we have to learn those names, and why do we use those complicated names?
Yeah, for sure. I know where I grew up, people talk about perch a lot, and there aren't actually any perch down where I grew up in southeast Kansas. All the fish that people are referring to as perch are actually sunfish.
Yeah.
So.
One of the episodes that I keep threatening to do is when is a perch? And so talking about the different types of perch, and that took me a while to learn, because a perch in one part of the state is not the same kind of a quote unquote perch in another part of the state. So you got to know where you're at and who you're talking to. But yeah, the first few times that people told me they were out catching perch in Kansas, I got excited thinking that we were going to have a fishery I didn't know about. But good name for those centrarchids.
Cool. Well, thinking about the differences between, native species or even subspecies of some of these native species or the introduced species? What are some big differences or similarities between some of those groups? Does any of it have to do with like where they breed or where they spend time?
Yeah. So thinking about the habitat, the flowing water versus kind of more stagnant water. So the type of habitat, a lot of the native fish really prefer, flowing type water. So lotic habitats. Some of the non-native fish could be thriving in lentic type habitats. One of the really cool adaptations that we see with a lot of native species is that they're anadromous.
What's that mean? That's a big word.
Yeah, a big word. So they spend most of their time living out at the ocean, right? And so, we think about, everyone kind of knows that stereotypical picture of grizzlies standing in the stream and catching trout or salmon as they're swimming upstream. Well, most of those fish have grown up in the ocean, but they were hatched in freshwater streams, and they are going to spawn in freshwater before they die. And so that has that anadromous migrating from freshwater habitat out to the ocean and then returning to freshwater to spawn, has a lot of benefits. And so ocean tends to be more nutrient rich. There's a ton of growth out in the ocean. There's more food for a lot of these fish to consume. They can grow faster. If we think about the vastness of the ocean, it's easier to get away from predators. Yeah. So you're going to have higher survivability. The flip side of that is that the freshwater environment safer for the eggs in the young of the year. They don't have to fight huge currents, for example. They might be able to casually kind of drift downstream. The young of year can have some time, or those young of year are just freshly hatched eggs and larvae that are growing up. They have kind of a little bit of time to grow up before they're washed out to the ocean to kind of thrive. And so this situation, this anadromous lifestyle, is really fascinating, the benefits to the fish themselves, but also brings a lot of nutrients from the ocean into these freshwater systems. So you see entire trophic cascades of different types of growth and activity related to the movement of these fish from freshwater out to saltwater and back. So really a cool adaptation that these fish have.
That's really cool. I guess one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking about all that is there an advantage for a fish from like a water chemistry or an oxygen standpoint to lay those eggs in fresh water that might be flowing versus out in the ocean? I mean, yeah. That salt water, I could see that as trying to dry the eggs out, and then maybe the water flowing over the eggs might help with oxygen.
Yeah, that water flowing is really, really important. So if you take the flow of water and stop it even for a very short period of time, an hour or so, bacteria and fungus are going to start to grow on those eggs very, very quickly. In fact, that's one of the hardest parts of rearing fish in captivity. It took a long time for us to figure out that we had to keep that water moving. Putting them in a jar that's not moving, it works for some species, but that movement can be really important for others. So that's a really unique part of it. The other thing is, I get asked a lot, and this is kind of a silly question, but I get asked a lot if fish pee. Right?
Yeah.
Do fish pee?
Yeah.
And if you think about that depends on whether they're freshwater fish or saltwater fish. Right? Huh. And so if I take a fish, a salty, if you think about our bodies, we need salt, we need different chemicals in our body. And so just thinking about osmosis, water wants to go where there's more salt or more particles.
Sure.
Right? And so water will flow into fish if the fish is saltier than its environment. And that happens in freshwater systems. So water is flowing into fish, wants to actively move into fish in freshwater. So those fish need to get rid of that water. So those fish do pee. If we flip that and put that fish out in the ocean, right, then they are less salty than their environment. So the water wants to be pulled out of them. And so those fish are they have processes in their body that allows them to drink salt water or conserve water, reuse water throughout their body, and they generally do not pee. So the reason I mention all that, one, it's a fun fact, but also thinking about a fish being able to go from one environment to the other and back, there's a lot of physiological changes that need to occur, and those are triggered a lot of times genetically. And so the fish, as it starts to do its migration back, you'll see those physiological changes. But crazy to think of all that, how all that worked. A lot like a caterpillar, being able to switch into a butterfly. Mesmerizing. Nature's crazy.
Yeah, that's really cool. Animals have so many different adaptations that allow them to do things that it's mind-boggling sometimes, for sure. I guess thinking about that lifestyle or natural history of being anadromous and breeding in one place and going somewhere else to spend most of the rest of their life, are there other groups of fish or other species that do that commonly, or is this something that we only see in trout and maybe salmon?
Yeah, the trout and salmon are the big ones. I mean, there are definitely other fish that do that. Striped bass are a big one. There's a lot of smelt that will, migrate in and out. We see that in the Great Lakes or, out in the northeast of Chesapeake Bay area. A lot of fish will go into brackish water. Brackish means that it's a mix of fresh water and salt water. So we see a lot of species that, you think about that, you get mixing there. You get freshwater species that will go to saltwater. You get saltwater that will come to freshwater. A really cool interaction. As far as other groups that aren't fish, there aren't a lot that I know about that do this, have this activity. That doesn't mean there aren't any. I just am not familiar with them. So really, cool adaptation and cool to think about the fish moving from one area to another.
Yeah, I had forgotten about striped bass. That's definitely an important species from a recreational standpoint. Sturgeon was some of the critters I was thinking about.
Yeah.
There definitely are some species of sturgeon that do that. There's some that don't.
Yep.
Like trout. But I was thinking about those guys. Is there a term for, or do critters exist that do the opposite thing? Are there any that spend most of their life in freshwater but go to saltwater to reproduce?
Yeah, and so the opposite of anadromous is called catadromous. And so catadromous species will breed in saltwater, and then they'll move to freshwater. The most common example of that in our area is the American eel. And so the American eel migrates up rivers. There was just one recently caught in Kansas about a year ago. And so they move up into rivers, they can swim really long distances, right? They're coming from the Gulf of Mexico and making it to Kansas. That's
amazing.
Yeah, pretty good trip. And then they live their lives there, and they can live up to about 40 years in these freshwater systems. Wow. So really long time. After that period of time, they say, hey, we want to migrate back. And every American eel in the world all migrates back to a little area called the Sargasso Sea, which is in the western Atlantic Ocean. So this little tiny area where all these eels come back to, and they're going to reproduce. And then those eggs or larvae are going to drift in the ocean currents back to shore, back to the Gulf of Mexico, back to wherever. They're going to find some fresh water, and they're going to swim upstream and complete that cycle. So that catadromous life cycle is really, really cool. One of the sad things that's happened is as we've changed habitats in these rivers, we've put up a lot of dams. We've minimized a lot of this upstream movement. So a lot of these species that we used to see moving up and downstream in these big rivers are now blocked. And so American eel is a great example. In Kansas, we used to see consistent numbers of them, and now maybe we get a report every 5 or 10 years of one being caught. And so that fragmentation of the habitat has definitely had some impact on these species for sure.
Well, I tell you what, when I was a little kid, I used to watch lots of nature shows, and seeing some videos or footage of predation events involving moray eels in coral reefs and stuff like that. That was the sea monster for me. Like I'd go swimming at the lake or something like that, and I'd think about, I just have these images of a moray eel coming out and grabbing a hold of something and pulling it back into the reef, and that was spooky.
They're pretty impressive. They also have these recurved teeth too, so when they bite onto a fish, it tries to struggle, and it can only go one way, and that's down its throat. So pretty cool adaptation, I guess, if you're the eel, not so much if you're the fish. But thinking about moray eels, or what creatures live in the Amazon or something like that. There's some areas of fresh water I wouldn't necessarily want to be in, but North America, I feel pretty safe in.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. I feel pretty safe when I'm swimming and that sort of thing too. Going back to trout, we've been talking about eels, I guess, but going back to trout, or you talked about their lifestyle adaptation of coming from the ocean back to freshwater to breed. Do they have any physiological adaptations that are interesting or that we don't see very often in other fish species?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. So that ability to change their physiology to survive in freshwater and saltwater is really cool, I think, and that takes a lot more needs to change than just we think about. So pretty cool feature there. Another really common one that when I think about trout, I think about their adipose fin. And so if you look on the dorsal side, the back of a trout, they have their dorsal fin. But behind that, kind of between their dorsal fin and their tail, or their caudal fin, there's just a little bump of flesh, right? Mm-hmm. That little bump is called the adipose fin, and that's, I think, a pretty unique feature. You know, it's found on trouts and salmonids. It's found on some catfish. We used to think that it was just residual, didn't really have any purpose at all, and so we would do things like mark recapture studies. We would cut those off, thinking that it didn't impact the fish at all, to know that a fish was caught. And more recent studies have shown that that fin actually helps fish to sense different flows. And so, you know, it's kind of cool to think. It seems like a relatively low level is probably the wrong term, but kind of an introductory thing. Like, hey, it's cool that as scientists we can still discover, you know, foundational, fundamental science like that. Like, what's the purpose of this fin, even though it's been studied for 100 years or something? It's kind of cool to think about. But that adipose fin comes to mind. It just, you know, it helps them sense flows in different habitats. And if we think about where trout and salmon are living in those streams and rivers, makes sense that they'd have something that can help them with that. Yeah,
for sure. Is that the part of a trout that you make trout bacon from?
Trout bacon. I don't have any idea. That sounds like something I need to eat.
I don't know. I just figured, if it's made out of fat, maybe you could make bacon out of it.
I would guess that's their belly, but heck, I don't know. I've never eaten an adipose fin, but maybe that's something I need to do, Drew.
That's something I usually throw away when I'm cleaning catfish, too.
Yeah, well, maybe we need to start saving it.
Maybe. Thinking about eating trout and eating an adipose fin and making bacon out of it made me realize that we've gotten all the way this far into the episode and we haven't talked about what trout eat.
Yeah.
So what's their diet? Are there differences depending on what species we're looking at and that sort of thing?
Yeah, most of the trout, when we think about trout, most of them are going to be eating insects, and so one of the great ways to go catch them is to fly fish for them, right? And so we're imitating an insect that's landing on the water, and so that would be a lot of the native species would be eating different insects. Some of the bigger trout, lake trout, are going to eat other fish, amphibians. So when we start getting into big groups, they may eat more of that. By far, the vast majority of native trout would be invertebrates of some sort. So they're out there, they're eating invertebrates in a lot of those native habitats.
Cool. So what invertebrate does Berkeley Powerbait mimic?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so then that takes us back to, and you know, I've actually had people ask me that, right? Why does that work? And that it's a silly question, but it's also, if we think about these fish, they're hatchery raised, right? Most of these fish, all the fish that we're catching in Kansas have been raised by a hatchery to be put into these lakes to be caught. And so it is much easier to take a pelleted feed and feed these fish than it would be to go catch a bunch of mayflies or grasshoppers or something and figure out how to put those into the pond itself. And so most of these fish have been feed trained and grown up eating pellets from a bag. So when we're going out there with our power bait, our little nugget, and a lot of them are brightly colored, right? And so it's something that they can see, and it just gives the fish an opportunity to go find a little pellet that looks exactly like what they've been eating for the last year or two of their lives, and they're going to go nibble on that. So not super glamorous reasoning there, but that's the reality of it, and they've been fed fish food, and we're trying to mimic commercially raised fish food in those examples.
I had never even thought about it that way. When we're trout fishing in places where they're a native species or they naturally reproduce and they're eating the invertebrates that are out there, people talk about matching the hatch, right?
Yeah.
You need to throw a fly that's similar to what they're eating right now. And I guess I had never even made the connection that you're sort of matching the hatch when you throw that power bait out there in a place with stock trout.
Sure. That's mostly what we're doing. A lot of these species, too, I mentioned the invertebrates, they'll eat some vegetation as well. And so, corn is an example where berries may fall into a stream, and a kernel of corn might look somewhat similar to that. And so those might be examples. The flip side of that is a kernel of corn also kind of looks like a pellet of fish food. And so depending on where you're at, that might be why the kernel of corn is working. So a lot of times where, they're just looking for something to eat. These fish have been fattened up and fed and had an easy life, so they don't really feel like they need to work. Throwing something out there that's square probably work a lot of times with these fish.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, now this is, I don't mean to sort of poo-poo on anybody here, but growing up in southeast Kansas, we had access to hatchery-raised trout, and we caught some trout in the trout pits, or trout pit, and ate them, and just really did not enjoy the flavor and the texture of the meat of those fish.
Yeah.
And I just sort of decided I don't like trout. And I know lots of people really like those hatchery-raised trout, and I'm not knocking you. If you enjoy it, absolutely harvest those fish and eat them. But later on, when I got the opportunity to catch some wild trout in Colorado and California, I don't know if I've eaten any Colorado trout, but definitely ate a bunch of brook trout in California when I was out there. And the texture and the flavor of that meat was just totally different.
Yeah.
Those were good fish, and I really liked it. So what's the difference there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've probably had people call you or tell you that about venison too. I mean,
Sure.
We hear similar things, and a lot of it's probably the handling with venison and how they're processed, maybe a little bit more, and it'd be your area of expertise. But thinking about the trout, you are what you eat. And going back to that, and a lot of times having variety in your diet, and being able to grow at a slower rate. The goal of these hatcheries is to make money, and to make money, they need to grow these fish as quickly as they can and as cheaply as they can. So a lot of times they're not eating really high quality food. They're eating what they can to get the growth rates where they need to be because they want the fishing opportunity, right? And so I would tend to agree with you with the flavor, right? I mean, if you put them side by side, a native trout that's been eating a variety of wild food its entire life is going to have a firmer texture. It's going to have a milder flavor, a mild but good fishy flavor. A lot of times these fish that are hatchery raised tend to, their flesh tends to be softer, and the flavor tends to be almost, I don't know how to describe it. It tastes kind of like pond water is how people describe it to me a lot, right? But that doesn't mean they're bad. It just means they need to be prepared a little bit differently. So a little bit stronger seasoning, blackening the fish is really common when you catch them in Kansas. Putting some seasoning them a little bit heavier than you may a native trout that you're trying to preserve that delicate flavor in. It would be my recommendation. But it all goes back to you are what you eat, and they're eating a lot different things in a hatchery because they have a different purpose than they are out in the wild.
That makes sense. For sure. You talked about deer. I don't necessarily hear so much about variation in the flavor of deer, but pronghorn, that's a species I do hear a lot of variation. People talk about some pronghorn being really good, and if they're eating lots of sagebrush, maybe they're not so tasty.
Sure.
I can see that for sure.
I heard that growing up, and, it's been pointed out to me that when I was younger, I used to throw a deer in the back of my pickup truck and drive around for 3 or 4 days and show everyone that I'd shot it before I chopped it up. So that now I process them, almost immediately. That time to processing might have something to do with that flavor as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So coming back to trout fishing in Kansas, how's that opportunity exist? Where would a person go if they wanted to catch trout? Do they need any special permits, anything like that?
Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks has this cool program, and it's just to provide another fishing opportunity in the cooler months. And so from December 1st to March 31st, there's a trout season in Kansas where you need to buy a trout stamp. I think it's $14.50 or something like that. So you need that, and you need a regular fishing license to be able to fish for them. Outside of those dates, come April, if there's still some trout around, you're allowed to fish for them without that trout stamp. But in order to fish for them during the season when they're going to be most active, you got to have that trout stamp. They're stocked throughout the state. There's about 30 or 35 different locations. You can look that up on Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks website. They have these different fish where they go stock them, and they've stocked them, a few different times, at least the popular ones, a few different times throughout the season. And so that gives you opportunities to go out and catch fish that are active out there, throughout this kind of winter season. When maybe other fish have slowed down, so not as many options, but good time to go out and catch these different fish. Just kind of a different opportunity, different type of fishing in Kansas.
Cool. Are there any special ways that we would fish for those trout besides power bait?
Sure. Power bait's the most common. That's kind of the easiest thing, but you can go fly fish for them. And so getting out your fly rod, it's a good excuse to do that in Kansas, a good opportunity. Another fun way to do it, and it depends on what winter we have, right? But going out and ice fishing, especially in the northern part of Kansas, the last couple years we've had ice that's reached 4 inches thick. And that 3 to 4 inch range, I like to say 4 inches because I'm a little more on the safe side. 4 inches thick is when it's safe. There's something called a spud bar, which is basically a long metal walking stick kind of deal, and you kind of hit the ice with that as you walk to make sure it's not gonna break through. But the ice fishing in Kansas is just a cool opportunity, and trout provide a good excuse to do that. You might catch some crappie or something like that when you're out there too. But thinking about slower retrievals, getting through that ice, you can get really fancy with it. They have all kinds of electronics that you can buy to make sure there are fish below you. You can watch where your lure is compared to the fish, or you can just go punch a hole in the water and drop down a line and see what happens too. But I'd say the fly fishing and the ice fishing, two good ways to go out there and enjoy fishing in the colder months.
Very cool. So one of the things that you just mentioned was that you might catch a crappie or something like that while you're ice fishing for trout. If we want to go to one of those bodies of water where trout are stocked and we're fishing for crappie or bluegill or bass during trout season, do we need to make sure that we've got that trout stamp?
Well, that depends on the body of water, whether you need to have a trout stamp in those areas or not. And so this is new for 2024. Some different ponds or bodies of water are going to require that you have a trout stamp, whether you're actively fishing for trout. Other bodies of water, if you're not targeting trout, then you do not need to have a trout stamp. So it's going to depend on which body of water you're going to. Definitely make sure you look up the regulations for that body of water before you're going out, and make sure that you are only targeting trout if you do have that trout stamp.
Well, Joe, thanks for bringing this topic to us of thinking about catching trout out in the Great Plains, and definitely a really cool opportunity to get out and fish during a time of year when we don't necessarily fish a lot. Some people do, but other people don't necessarily do a lot of bass fishing and that sort of thing during the wintertime here in Kansas. And it's a really cool opportunity that our state agency provides for folks to catch a fish that we don't normally catch in Kansas. And definitely that trout stamp helps fund that process. So good stuff.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. Just like always, please like, subscribe, leave us a review. We're definitely starting to get some reviews on the different podcast platforms, and we appreciate that. Check us out on YouTube if you want to see the visual side of what's going on. We're starting to have a lot of folks view there too, and we appreciate y'all. And we'll just look forward to talking to you again here in a couple of weeks about a terrestrial topic. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension
and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.